Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the conversation to respond to the questions you post. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed on Friday to all who registered. And we are streaming the webinar on Facebook Live. All resources that you see shared as links in the chat will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants, and materials are accessible on GLR's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, aka CLIP. Please take a few seconds to create a free account if you haven't yet done so that you don't miss the bios, slides, and other materials from today's session. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on July 20th, we have an exciting double header with a peer exchange focused on the work of our partners at Reach Out and Read at 12:30 Eastern Time. And then at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we continue our series focused on accelerating equitable learning recovery and following up to last week's session on state policies and spending decisions to meet the current moment, this time in conversation with chief state school officers. Lastly, please make plans to join us the following week, beginning on Monday, July 26th, for GLR Week, Bright Spots and Silver Linings. We are excited for multiple learning and engagement opportunities all week long that will further the discussion on meeting the moment and ensuring equitable learning acceleration and early school success as we look ahead to the 2021-2022 school year. Please take a look at the options on the screen and plan to join us for as often as you can. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for both next week's events and for GLR Week 2021. Joining you now is Emily Samos, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you. And thank you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar titled Learning Happens Everywhere, Returning to School with a Whole Child Perspective. Today's exchange of ideas is our final of 3 sessions that follow on to a spring forum co-sponsored with Education Week and co-hosted with the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. That April session examined data indicating that post-pandemic fall 2021 classrooms will include more students who have not yet had a full year of kindergarten, Head Start, or pre-K, and for whom everyday attendance is not yet habit or routine, bringing with them also the effects of having spent so many months isolated from peers in classroom settings. And so today we will take the chance to view this data presentation together and together see the visual representation of what classrooms may look like to better understand the ensuing challenges that teachers will face. And during that spring session, we also previewed several promising teaching and learning strategies with great potential to help early grade teachers and all teachers mitigate these challenges. And now our follow-on sessions allow us more time to further explore the innovative interventions and how they can support our youngest learners and all students as they get back on track. Oops, sorry. Okay, excuse me. So after we review the data presentation together today, we will have the opportunity to again learn about the guiding principles for whole child design from Dr. Pamela Cantor, and the way those principles are applied using Turnaround for Children's Whole Child Design Blueprint. Dr. Cantor will also be joined by her colleagues, including educators who are using the approach and can speak to the ways in which the Whole Child Design Blueprint is being used in school settings and how it can help ease the challenges teachers will face as they work to accelerate equitable learning recovery this fall and beyond. And to get us started, I have the privilege of introducing our esteemed moderator, Dr. Jacqueline Jones, who is President and CEO of the Foundation for Child Development. Dr. Jones will then briefly introduce Dr. Cantor and her colleagues and launch our discussion. And I remind you to please find complete bios for all of our speakers linked in the chat and found on Clip, as Sierra mentioned. So again, Dr. Jacqueline Jones is President and CEO of the Foundation for Child Development. She previously served as the country's very first Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning in the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration. Prior to federal service, she was the Assistant Commissioner for Early Childhood Education in the New Jersey State Department of Education and was a Senior Research Scientist at the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey. So Dr. Jacqueline Jones, I now turn it over to you, and I'm excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and a warm welcome to everyone on the call. As Emily mentioned, today's session is entitled Learning Happens Everywhere, Returning to School with a Whole Child Perspective. The pandemic has left us in unknown educational territory. The school experience, whether virtual or in person, has been disrupted, and educators are struggling to meet the needs of children who will be returning to school, having had a range of experiences. And those experiences will connect to the school curriculum in many different ways. I'm delighted to be able to engage in conversation this afternoon with our distinguished presenter and our commentators. Our presenter, Dr. Pamela Cantor, has practiced child psychiatry for nearly 2 decades, specializing in trauma. Dr. Cantor founded Turnaround for Children after co-authoring a study on the impact of the 9/11 attacks on New York City school children. She's a visiting scholar in education at Harvard University, a member of the Council of Distinguished Scientists for the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, and a leader of the Science of Learning and Development Initiative. Elizabeth Miller, who will be a commentator, is a content design specialist at Turnaround for Children, where she designs content and develops tools for Turnaround's partners. Elizabeth previously taught elementary school in the Cambridge, Massachusetts public schools and in the Boulder Valley, Colorado public schools, where she worked on collaborative development of experiential project-based curriculum that provided holistic learning opportunities for her students. Dr. David Miyashiro is our second commentator. He is the superintendent of the Cajon Valley Union School District in Southern California. He's an award-winning education leader with a 17-year career spent revolutionizing learning approaches, education models, and school district capabilities. His awards include Superintendent of the Year and recognition from the White House and the U.S. Department of Education as one of the top 35 leaders in personalized learning. And I will add that he and his staff have created some very cool videos. In a few minutes, we will begin our conversation with Dr. Cantor about Turnaround for Children's guiding principles for equitable whole child design. And we will explore how this framework can be used in classrooms to address the multiple challenges we expect teachers will face this fall. But before Dr. Cantor, as Emily mentioned, we'd like to do some level setting for today's conversation. We're going to watch a 10-minute video recording by Curriculum Associates, NWEA, and Attendance Works. The video is from last April's grade level reading Ed Week webinar, and it presents some interesting visualization of data on the implications for the fall 2021 classroom composition. Sierra, please roll the video.
Please tell us how you structured the data that you gathered and what these data imply.
We're going to structure the data around these colors, which reflect how data is depicted within the iReady program. So you'll see, we'll talk about green bars. These green bars indicate these are the kids who are on grade level. They're doing great. Okay. We'll also talk about red bars, and these red bars will indicate percentage of kids who are 2 or more grades below their chronological or current grade level. So these are kids who are pretty far behind and they're really struggling. and they're going to need lots of additional supports to realize success and to track with grade level curriculum. So this data is for reading, and it's grades 1 through 8. And just to orient you to it, please take a look at grade 3. Okay, so what this says is, in the gray bars, historically, 65% of kids were reading at grade level at this point in time in the school year. And this year it has dropped to 59%. You see that the drops of the percentage of kids on grade level is certainly more pronounced and most significant in grades 1, 2, and 3. Critical grades, where we're starting by grade 3 to make the shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And we also, I think, all understand the criticality of grade 3. Great organizations like NAEP would tell you lots of sobering statistics about the fact that if you can't read at grade level by grade 3, you're 4 times less likely to graduate from high school. You'll also see in the older grades, there are decreases about the percentage of kids who are on grade level, but they are certainly much, much smaller. But I do want to point out that these decreases of grade level reading expectations and performance for all kids is present in all grades. Now, the flip side of this, unfortunately, is that it's not just that kids are not at grade level. Some of them are very, very far from grade level, and that's depicted by the bars here in red. So if I were to take, for example, 3rd grade, what this says is historically 16% of the kids were multiple grades below their current grade level, and this year it's dropped to 22%. Okay. Now, if I want to understand to what degree these challenges have played out differently for different kinds of populations, I can take a look at this data, and this is specifically for 3rd grade reading. If I take a look at this, what this indicates here is that for schools that serve majority Black populations, right, the percentage of kids that are on grade level dropped from 47% to 38%, and the percentage of kids who are multiple grades below their current grade level has gone from 27% to 38%. The comparable number for schools that serve majority Latino populations are 8% and 9%, and the comparable numbers for schools that serve majority white populations, 6% and 5%. So this tells you what I don't think anyone's surprised to hear, which is that the implications of the pandemic in terms of school disruptions have disproportionately impacted students of color. I've thrown a lot of data at you really quickly. What's the sum of this? So let's just take an illustration here. Just imagine this is a classroom populated in large part with kids of color, in large part lower income kids. And this is what the world looked like pre-pandemic, if you remember those times, right? In fall of 2019, I have about half my kids are in the yellow chairs, meaning they're a little behind, and if they have a great year, they'll catch up. And I have about the same number of green chairs as red chairs, meaning about the same number of kids who are sort of doing great on grade level as the number of kids who are in red who are going to need additional supports to realize success in the classroom. Okay, that's what it looked like. This is what I think is going to look like in the fall of 2021, a different distribution of those chairs. And specifically, I'm saying we were going in this classroom, we went from 7 kids on grade level to 4. If I think about the red chairs, we went from 7 kids that were multiple grades below grade level to 10. And 2 of those kids have really not participated in school consistently since the pandemic hit. So for the last year, and 3 of those kids, imagine, will stay virtual. So as a teacher, I have to teach 25 kids in person, simultaneously 3 kids virtually. That's hard. And all kids will have social emotional needs, but imagine there's a handful that have experienced unique levels of trauma that the teacher may or may not be aware of day 1 of school. So what's the sum of all this? Why am I telling you this? So the sum of all this, the data, this depiction here, is that I think we all understand that teaching is more important today than it ever has. But I do want to point out the job is different. It is very different, and it's much harder, right? You think about all those complexities we just talked about that are a result of that data, which are a result of what's going on with COVID and school disruptions. So we support prioritizing the needs of teachers as we think about all the new strategies that we want to employ to support students. We support prioritization of teacher time, teacher needs, and all forms of teacher recognition. Thank you.
Thanks, Woody. Beth, what do the data imply about what teachers need to consider as they plan for their K-3 classes this fall?
Thank you so much for having me. As my colleagues have mentioned, data is crucial as we enter this next academic school year. Among the many ways in which schools are being transformed by the pandemic, changes in public school enrollment will likely have important consequences in elementary classrooms across the nation. Because the academic and non-academic skills students develop in their preschool and early elementary school years are foundational to important long-term outcomes, understanding these changes and finding ways to effectively support our youngest students is critical. Drawing on recent research, we offer 4 timely considerations. Districts across the country reported substantial drops in the number of students enrolled, especially in their kindergartens this past school year. This shift suggests a likely scenario of a kinder bubble in coming years as more and older students enter school. Additionally, districts may see larger split age classes for both first grade and kindergarten cohorts, and with many more students unfamiliar with in-person classroom routines. In some, we need to prepare for greater age differences in kindergarten and in some first grade classrooms. Schools are also seeing sizable declines in preschool enrollment. If these missing students enroll next year, more students will enter formal schooling without typical pre-K preparation. Additionally, as my colleagues have discussed, the pandemic is likely widening inequalities and exacerbating opportunity gaps. Taken together, these trends suggest a wider skill disparity upon entry. Third, we can use summer strategically. Many systems are working to expand their instructional and enrichment programming this summer. Additionally, promising early kindergarten programs bring early childhood and school partners together to promote a successful transition for children and families in underserved communities. Such efforts help children build social skills, acquire the confidence, and become excited about classroom learning. Finally, the academic and non-academic data will play a crucial role in helping educators and families understand the ways to best meet the needs of young students. We also offer some classroom recommendations for educators, including the importance of fostering a sense of belonging and purpose. Elementary teachers are so good at this. Kindergarten teachers in particular play a pivotal role in cultivating students' love of learning, and it all starts with relationships. Taking the time to engage students in getting to know their teacher and their classmates while making space to build learning community is essential in the first few weeks. Second, whole group instruction can be challenging to design when there are a variety of learning needs among students. When you want to provide opportunities to address students' various needs, consider creating small, flexible groups of students. We also stress the need to explicitly teach, model, practice, and monitor classroom routines. This provides students with a predictable and organized learning environment, one in which they feel secure and empowered to self-manage. Finally, I think it's important to acknowledge the heroic efforts educators have made this past year. Teachers have found powerful ways to connect to their students, whether virtually or in person, and those relationships are more critical now than ever as we work to collectively support our youngest students. Thank you for having me.
Hetty, the pandemic is causing greater rates of absenteeism. Tell us what we have to be aware of for this next school year.
Thanks so much for having me here for this really critical conversation. Enrollment hesitancy among families is likely to result in some students, especially from communities hard hit by the pandemic, delaying participation in in-person classrooms. And even more concerning, schools are likely to experience higher levels of chronic absence in the early grades than ever before. Even in a normal school year, it takes a while for families with young students to get used to a new environment, establish a regular routine of showing up to school, and put in place transportation and backup supports so kids can get to class even when families face challenges. And it will be even harder this year when so many students have been out of the routine of in-person school for some as many as 18 months. Prior to the pandemic, 1 out of 10 kindergartners and first graders were chronically absent nationwide. And in low-income communities, this could be double or triple that level. This data from Connecticut offers a picture of what we may see. Chronic absence are almost double. Kindergartners have the highest levels of chronic absence, but what's concerning is those chronic absence levels stay elevated in the remaining elementary grades. Left unaddressed, high rates of chronic absence predict adverse consequences for learning. Chronically absent kindergartners are less likely to read on grade level by third grade, more likely to continue to be chronically absent, more likely to be retained. The gaps grow over time. And students living in poverty suffer the most. They're more likely to experience systemic attendance barriers that are harder to resolve and can last multiple years. And they're less likely to have the resources at home to make up for the lost learning time in the classroom. But the impact isn't just on the individual students who are chronically absent, it's also on their peers, whose math and reading scores can also be affected. Chronic absence is a leading indicator and a cause of educational inequity. And all of this has implications for how schools and communities can support our youngest students and their families in the coming year. It means that we're going to need to enhance our attention to school climate. We'll need to monitor attendance and chronic absence data so we can better allocate resources for early outreach and intervention and engage in continuous improvement. If kids aren't there, maybe what we're offering isn't working. We're going to have to support positive problem solving, not punitive action. And it's going to make it even more essential that we establish authentic partnerships between teachers, parents, and caregivers, those who are, quote, the learning guardians for our kids. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the chance to be here.
Thank you, Sierra. So this video certainly gives us a good deal to think about as we try to support young children and their educators in the coming school year. Pam, every day we hear about what's happening to children across the country, the trauma of the pandemic, grief and loss that they may have experienced, and the impact on learning. Please set some context for us about what children, their families, and their schools are experiencing today.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. It's great to be with you all. As we just saw, the US today is a country of dramatic inequalities, where the conditions of living in America have been exposed, along with the dramatic inequalities in the conditions for learning in America. Take a moment and let's think about who will be walking into our summer programs and our classrooms, the kind of variation we're going to see. You may have children who are happy, children who are anxious, children who are eager, and children who feel disconnected. You may have young people who have experienced trauma, like the loss of a loved one to COVID-19, or someone who supported their family and their siblings after the loss of a loved one. There could be students who have not seen the inside of a classroom for 1.5 years, but have learned how to cook, repair the family car, tutor their younger siblings, or even play a jazz riff on their guitar. There will be children who saw themselves do things out of the classroom that they never thought they could do. All of this and more is likely going to be walking through your doors. Our young people have grown in many ways during this time, and there could be no better way to build their confidence than to see that and acknowledge this growth. And then there is what COVID brought to your own lives. How to get ready to welcome the good, the great, the challenges that we'll see. But to state the obvious, all of us have been through 18 months like no other. The way Americans work, live, learn, and are cared for have been exposed. And as much as we knew that things were never equal, today the inequities and the unfairnesses are undeniable. Who had access to high-speed internet and quality instruction time and who didn't? Whose schools opened their doors to students safely and who could not? Whose communities suffered the highest proportions of COVID infections and deaths and whose didn't? What we have seen during the pandemic, we can't now unsee. More than ever, we need to see young people returning to schools as individuals, each with their own very individual experience of this lockdown and the national reckoning on race, each with their own developmental starting point in recovering from this time. But there are assumptions and dominant narratives about what we are looking at. The trauma of COVID, the impact of racialized violence and historic inequities of opportunity, the problem of learning loss and lost learning time, the beliefs young people have about whether they and their identities and cultures are welcome in their learning communities, and the fears they have about their future. And then just how many of our students particularly those most vulnerable, will often internalize these messages about difference as damage or loss as personal failure, a narrative which runs counter to everything we know from development and learning science. So this situation begs the question, are we looking at different problems, or are we looking at different faces of the same problem? That variation, promise, and individuality are the essence of human development and the way we learn. But the approaches we've taken thus far to learning in schools have not fully challenged our assumptions about learning. Is it highly variable, or does it fall into a bell curve? Or intelligence, is it defined by our genes or by the context that drives their expression? Or skills, are they malleable or are they fixed? And talent, is it plentiful or is it scarce? Or even human potential, what would any child be capable of under the right conditions? Should we continue to offer menus of labels and interventions, or conceive of a bolder response that reflects a new equitable purpose for education and learning settings that is encompassing, relationship-rich, holistic, rigorous, and profoundly positive and engaging of students' interests and capabilities? What would it mean if all the places where children are growing and learning were designed to meet each child, the whole child, where they are, and help each and every one develop to their fullest potential? What might that look like? Under the right conditions, imagine what any child would be capable of. This is what we're going to be talking about today. The developmental and learning sciences paint an optimistic picture of what is possible.
Thank you, Pam. Could you say a bit more about what you mean by the science of learning and development? From your perspective, what is it, and how should we be using this knowledge?
Absolutely. You know, before COVID-19 and the events of this last year, if I had had the opportunity to talk to you about human development, the development of the brain, and learning science, I would have begun with this. There are 20,000 genes in the human genome, yet in our lifetime, fewer than 10% will ever be expressed. What determines what's in that 10%? It is context, the environments, experiences, and relationships in our lives. Genes are chemical followers. They are little packages of protein with receptors on their surface that are triggered into expression by context, the environments, experiences, and relationships. It is context that determines who we become, how we learn, and even the expression of our genes. So the risks and opportunities in development and learning sit inside this one profoundly important point, that there is no separation between nature and nurture, biology and environment, brain or behavior, only a collaboration between them. And as we said, this tells a very optimistic story about what every young person is capable of, because children's brains and bodies and abilities are malleable to experience, because the human brain is a dynamic living structure made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. The brain is also malleable over time. Most of its growth happens after we're born. So there are multiple opportunities to catch up along the way. So there are only 3 things to know about brain development: the astounding malleability of the human brain, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. So if we optimize the design of context, we optimize the possibility that our young people will not only catch up and recover from the effects of this year, but we will have created a big down payment on the learning settings we need to build for ours and their futures. And we have done that for some children, mostly middle class and affluent white children, kids who will have an easier time surmounting the effects of this year. This was the message in that data, because we have not done that for all children. We especially have not done that for students of color and students in low-income communities. This is the opportunity we have now and the inflection point we are in. This is a time of a huge financial investment in our children's learning and their futures. What happens from here depends on what we decide to invest in.
A lot to think about, Pam. We've had stressors this year, unlike any other. We know that stress is harmful to health and learning. From your perspective, what do you think the impact will be from the unique set of stressors from this year?
Well, today, the context, the environments, experiences, and relationships that were part of our lives a year ago have been hugely disrupted by the pandemic and the racialized violence that we have seen. There is a COVID paradox that we've lived with, and that has been that to stay physically safe, we've needed to be physically distant from some of the crucial relationships of our lives, including our teachers. These are the connections we need to feel safe, to manage stress, to build our resilience. And we know that social isolation has been particularly tough on teens, with dramatic increases in visits to emergency rooms and escalating suicide risk. And the crisis of trust that many young people are witnessing and experiencing right now, where those who should protect them don't, won't, or can't. Today, trust is broken in many places. And when trust and safety are broken like this, our bodies and our minds can be seized by stress. So let's talk about the biology of stress and what it does in particular to the structures of the limbic system, which is the learning and emotion center of our brains. The limbic system consists of three structures: the prefrontal cortex, which controls attention and concentration, the hippocampus, which controls many memory functions, and the amygdala, which regulates emotion. We know that the experience of stress is the most common naturally occurring example of negative context. When we experience stress, cortisol is released through our brains and our bodies. And the structures of the limbic system are loaded with receptors for the hormone cortisol. That's what produces that familiar feeling of fight, flight, freeze. It's intense when it happens, but if the stress is mild or tolerable, it's adaptive. It makes us alert and sharp, and it helps us prepare for a test or a performance. This is our limbic system at work: attention, concentration, focus, memory, preparation. But when children have persistently high levels of stress, and that stress is not buffered by the presence of a trusted and calm adult, something else can happen. Children can get locked in that fight or flight feeling where it just won't let up. And this is the condition known as toxic stress. Cortisol can do a lot of harm to the structures of the limbic system because adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But fortunately, that's not the end of the story. There's a big upside when we turn to another hormonal system and the hormone oxytocin. This is the hormonal system that produces feelings of trust, love, attachment, and safety, and that's not all. Oxytocin hits the same structures in the brain as cortisol. Yet oxytocin is the more powerful hormone because it can literally protect children at the level of the cell from the damaging effects of cortisol. Relationships that are strong and positive will cause the release of oxytocin. And this not only helps children manage stress, it offsets the damaging effects of cortisol, it ignites learning, and even produces resilience to future stress. So when we speak about the human relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're speaking of a connection that is built through consistent caring, protection, presence, and trust. The kind of relationship that can make a child believe something about themselves that they couldn't believe until you entered their life. Think about a relationship that you had that was like this, and put that story in the chat. When neurochemicals and hormones like oxytocin are released, here's what they do. They fuel neurons in the brain with energy, causing them to fire and connect to other neurons. And this is how the brain becomes wired and connected. And as the brain gets increasingly wired, we become able to do increasingly complex things, whether it's reading, resilience, or riding a bike. In fact, the human relationship and oxytocin are the most powerful example we have of positive context. So relationships, this is so important as we think about September, relationships are central to all development and learning. And relationships can happen and do happen everywhere that children grow and learn. Yes, in schools, but certainly outside of schools and even outside of classrooms. Children are building relationships everywhere all the time, in their homes, athletic fields, orchestras, community centers, after-school programs. Educators knowing the broad range of relationships and experiences in children's lives will introduce them to a young person's emerging interests and passions that we know don't always reveal themselves inside the classroom.
So Pam, what does all of this mean for us today? Thinking about the data that was presented in the video, what can educators do to address the needs of children this fall?
Well, education has long been central to the promise of America. But today we know something. We know that the 20th century system we inherited was never designed to develop the learner. It was never designed for equity. It was never designed to unleash the individual potential in each and every child. It was a racist design meant to select and sort, to support mass education, preparing students for their presumed place in life. But today we know that the insights from brain and learning science align profoundly with what so many parents know about their kids and want for their kids, and what so many teachers have been saying for years. That we can create learning environments and a system that recognizes children as whole people, values their assets, and supports them to excel in many different ways. The message in the science is clear. We need a new design mapped to the way the brain grows and children learn. A design that combines positive developmental relationships, environments filled with safety and belonging, rich, meaningful learning experiences so students discover what they're capable of, the intentional development of the critical skills, mindsets, and habits that all successful learners have, and integrated student supports. So a little bit deeper on each. That relationships are important is not new knowledge. We know that relationships engage children in ways that help them define who they are, what they can become, and how and why they are important to other people. This is more than just being nice to a child. We define positive developmental relationships as being about attachment, reciprocity, progressive complexity, and a balance of power. Relationships are central to motivation, engagement, and in fact, to all aspects of the learning process itself. I'm going to show you a video from a series of videos that we produced in collaboration with Edutopia, George Lucas's organization, and they were done in schools and community settings as part of a collaboration between Turnaround, Linda Darling Hammond, and Karen Pittman's Forum for Youth Investment. These videos illustrate the kind of integrated practice that I've been talking about These are places where this is happening right now. And you should know that since the launch of this series has had 12 million views.
Strong relationships are central to the learning process.
It's pretty interesting.
The science of learning and development tells us that we need to create learning environments for children to become attached to school and to the adults and other children in it.
When children have experiences of closeness and consistency and trust, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin has many, many positive effects on the development of the brain. So when we think about a relationship, we're talking about a child having an experience strong enough to release the hormone oxytocin.
You all have done outstanding work.
If you're in a positive emotional space, if you feel good about yourself, your teacher, that actually opens up the opportunity for more learning.
Good to see.
Strong.
So when we think about safety and belonging, in virtually every study of positive youth development, there's always one finding right at the top. And that is that children will struggle to engage and learn when they don't feel physically, emotionally, and identity safe, when they don't feel like they and their culture are represented and valued in their learning community. When we say rich learning experiences, we're speaking of the kinds of personalized instructional experiences that fully engage and challenge us, that build our confidence, and where we can discover what we're capable of. These are experiences that are meaningful and challenging across all academic disciplines, that build on students' prior knowledge, culture, and experiences, and help children discover what they can do in their zone of proximal development. And we also know that students learn best when they can engage and solve problems working with their peers. And when we speak of skills, habits, and mindsets, we know from learning science that learning is a fully integrated process. There is not a math part of the brain separate from the creative part of the brain. These parts of the brain are anatomically cross-wired and functionally integrated. And these skills that we're talking about are skills like self-regulation, executive functions, social skills, growth mindset, resilience, perseverance. The good news is that all of these skills are malleable. This means they can be built, they can be developed in settings designed to do just that. And we know that these are the essential 21st century skills for success in learning, work, and life. Here's another video. We call this the frog video from Edutopia, where a teacher in a middle school in South Portland, Maine, is partnering with one of her students to teach the executive function skill of prioritization. When you look at this video, look at the numbers of things that we've been talking about that are all represented in how this teacher and student are going about this.
Okay, so which one of those things is probably going to be your frog? Mark Twain said, if you wake up every morning and eat a frog, everything else will taste great. So I taught them to take their frog from the list, which is the thing they want to do the least, and get it out of the way, because everything else will seem easy.
A frog is like the most important assignment, like the one I'm really worried about.
Dry ice. So, okay, you got to do that. What's your frog?
It helps me like realize I need to get this done faster than I need to get this done. So even though this is more fun, I need to get this out of the way before I can do this.
So as soon as we're done with that priority list, I notice everyone gets right to work because they have it spelled out very clearly for them.
And finally, when we talk about integrated supports, all learning environments need to be set up with many more protective factors in place, including mental health and health. But integrated supports also means opportunities during and beyond the school day to balance academics with other things, with more flexible opportunities that build and nurture interests and passions. This kind of support will tip the balance toward an environment where students feel safe, motivated, engaged, willing to take academic risks, and where there are always multiple sources of emotional and academic support in different spaces and places. Bringing this kind of skill development to life in a learning setting means settings designed for relationships and teamwork, adults trained to know how the brain grows and how learning happens, and integrated tools to make it easier for teachers and practitioners to teach rigorous content and develop the skills of curious, self-directed learners at the very same time. Today, we know that a healthy context for learning and development requires attention to young people's safety, health, mental health, social, emotional, and cognitive development, their academic competencies, identity, and agency, and not some of these things, all of them together, because it is all one developmental story. And the non-negotiables for whole child design can cover all of these important bases for learning and holistic growth at a time that couldn't be more important than now. So here's the secret sauce. The development of the whole child emerges when we combine these elements into experiences that connect to one another. And if you want to picture this, picture a web of experiences, because this is how our brains actually develop. Lots of connections that happen between the structures of the brain. And these structures and connections are what produces increasingly complex skills. And frankly, a great example of this is how we learn to read. Lots of connections between brain structures like sight, hearing, expression, comprehension, all getting wired together to produce this incredible complex skill called reading. So there are places where this is already happening in schools and in community settings. So we know we can do it, but we have not done this at scale, and we need to. In the process, we can ask and answer the same question that researchers in other fields have asked. What can we do that will work optimally for this specific child in this context? And it is this question that will move all of us to fundamentally different answers about the way our schools and learning settings of the future need to be designed. The message in the science is so optimistic. Genes are chemical followers. Context shapes the expression of our genetic attributes. This is the biologic truth. And schools designed using the levers of human development such that what one child can do, nearly all children can do under highly favorable conditions. This can be our 21st century learning system, a system designed to see and unleash talent and potential and ensure that each and every young person can thrive. This vision constitutes a transformational shift in the purpose and potential of education, a dismantling of the systems that constrain this vision, grounded in everything we know today about human development, the development of the brain, and learning science. I remember once walking into a school that I was considering for my son, and I asked, what kind of child can thrive here? And one school, only one school said, all children can thrive here. This is what we're talking about today. We are talking about all children. So the question for many of us is, how do I start? How do I use these principles to move from where I am to this vision for whole child design? And I can't think of a better way to close this presentation than having two very special people share more about the answers to those questions. Jacqueline, I'm passing it back to you.
Getting unmuted in this age. Thank you, Pam. That was terrific. And I want to ask the audience to please put your questions and answers in the Q&A box. Pam's given us a lot to think about as we focus on a new framework for education. So Elizabeth and David, you've been listening to this exchange. Based on your personal experience with the whole child design blueprint, can you share a bit about yourselves? And then what resonated with you from the data and from Pam's presentation?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be with you all today. So, as Dr. Jones mentioned previously, before joining Turnaround for Children, I taught 3rd through 6th grade in the greater Boston area and in Colorado. I've also worked in a laboratory preschool throughout college, and I'm just thrilled to be sharing this space with early childhood and elementary educators. And I can't emphasize enough my appreciation for those of you in this space who've done the crucial and often too difficult work of directly supporting our students and families this year. And like many of you, I'm sure, I was the type of teacher who was often up in the middle of the night thinking about a specific student in my class. And sometimes that meant being in total awe of their successes and wondering how I could make every single day that great for them. And other days it meant really worrying and wondering what I needed to do differently to help them learn, engage, and be well. And so as I listened to the data that was shared today, my mind went directly to individual students, whether they're the ones represented by a green, a red, or a yellow chair, or the ones who might not have participated much in school this year. I know that they each have unique and nuanced interests, strengths, experiences, and needs. And I know that this year has been different for each one of them. And that's why I care so much about the science that Pam offered to us today. I'm always struck by one thing I've heard her say again and again, that what one child can do, nearly all children can do under highly favorable conditions. And we know that this year has presented inordinate challenges to our ability to do things like help students learn to read, but we also know that this is due to some pretty complex causes. So we hear about things like chronic absence in the data that often boil down to the lack of prioritization of the whole child and enduring inequities in our systems, or in other words, the inability to create those favorable conditions that each child deserves. And school has to work for students and families. I'm really excited to have Dr. Miyashiro here today to talk more about that. And I think what he'll talk about describes that secret sauce that Pam talked about, where we combine developmental relationships, supportive environments, rich learning experiences, the development of skills, habits, and mindsets, and integrated supports to create learning experience for students. And that has really helped clarify for me some of my biggest and most enduring questions about what each student needs, no matter what is going on around them. And I think these concepts help us to answer the question of what we need to do when we look at the data and weigh our next steps. So I'll pause there. And as we get further into the questions, I can speak more specifically to what this looks like and how some of my work currently at Turnaround with our new online toolbox might support your work aligning with these principles.
Thank you. David?
Every child should have a teacher like Liz. And thank you, Pam, for the research and the science, because now with these tools, we can actually change policy and practice. But I shared the first Edutopia video that Pam played earlier with our teachers and community in March of 2020. So when our state was forced to shut down and distance learning became the only option, we created digital curriculum and playlists based on our one-to-one program that our kids have had for the last 7 years, and had our teachers focus on reaching out to every individual family, not just the children, but their families, to check in on them, to show them their face, let them hear their voice, but also make sure that every family was heard and seen as well, focusing on the relationships and all the capital that we built in terms of the time we spent fostering healthy relationships in our community. Our vision is happy kids and healthy relationships on a path to gainful employment. And I don't think that we could have come there without the first 5 years of my career. So the last 15 years really have been spent following Pam's work and her research and building into some of those practices. But the first 5 years of my career, I was a principal in one of the worst performing schools in California. And API there, it was 521. That's how we measured proficiency in advanced in terms of No Child Left Behind. And so my superintendent said, your job is to get the school out of program improvement. So we focused on reading by 9 and teaching kids how to bubble little tests and score well on the standardized test scores. And we did that. We exited program improvement and became what's called a Title I high achieving school in the state of California. And we celebrated, our district celebrated our work, and teachers received awards. And I remember Sharon Ramirez, one of my 6th grade teachers, came in tears and vehemently slammed her hand on the desk and said, David, we haven't done a damn thing for these kids. She didn't use those words, she used some expletives. And she was describing some of the girls that had come home that had had babies in Texas. They had left our our school district to have children, came back to live with a generation of families that have had young children in school. And basically our staff came together and said, our children that are proficient or advanced are still going into generational gangs. They're still dropping out of high school. They're still getting pregnant while they're in school. We're not changing anything for their outcomes. And it really caused us to think about what we were doing in the name of standardized test scores. And that's when Sir Ken Robinson came on the scene and gave the first TED Talk about creativity, when Linda Darling Hammond and Pam started the research around whole child development. And we started to apply these principles early on in my career, now seeing the fruits of our labor in terms of engagement. And just super excited that the research and data are there now so that we can start informing policy and practice.
Sorry, guys, I'm going to stay unmuted because I can't unmute myself. So I think for our participants and for myself, we would like to know, what do the principles of whole child design actually look like in practice? And how can educators and leaders apply some of what Pam has shared to address the challenges we're seeing in the data?
Liz, you want to start?
Either way. Oh, perfect. I think I have a couple slides so I can jump right in. So Pam shared a lot about what the science of learning and development implies for the way that we design for the whole child. And as she described a turnaround, we use our whole child design blueprint, which you see in front of you, that maps onto the guiding principles that she shared. And this blueprint includes 3 core components: developmental relationships, supportive environments, and knowledge, skill, and mindset building that help us optimize our design of context and put a whole child purpose into action. And as you see in the outer ring, all of this is enabled by shared leadership and ownership, which creates the conditions in which educators can implement whole child strategies, structures, and practices that are defined throughout those 3 components. And so I want to briefly share just 3 examples, knowing that there are many, of what this looks like in practice in classrooms using tools from our online toolbox. So we can go to the next slide. And we heard from both NWEA and attendance work about the importance of focusing on school climate, norms, and fostering a sense of belonging to address some of the challenges we're seeing in the data, like chronic absenteeism, and to welcome students without pre-K experience. And so in our whole child design blueprint, this is captured in the supportive environments category. So as an example, the tool that you see here provides guidance and sample strategies for an approach to developing school or classroom norms and expectations, with an emphasis on co-creation, affirming diverse values, and shared power between students and adults, all a foundation for a sense of safety and belonging. So in practice, what this really means is that whole child design looks like classrooms with supportive environments where students and adults are really working together to create a culture in which all students are seen and belong. And on the next slide, you'll see that this ties in really well with another part of the blueprint. So we heard from Pam and from Attendance Works about the crucialness of building strong relationships with students to address the challenging state of learning right now. And so any action that we take to address something like reading gaps is enabled or enhanced by strong, trust-filled interactions and relationships with students. And so the tool that I've highlighted here can help educators build strong relationships with individual students, knowing again that in practice, whole child design looks like adults interacting with students to intentionally build trust alongside their learning experiences. And again, we'll share this resource, but throughout the toolbox site, you can find a wealth of strategies to help you put into action the prioritization of relationships. And then on the next slide, finally, Pam talked a lot about the level of variation that has always been part of how students learn and develop. And we also heard about the amplification of this variation due to the pandemic and the data from NWEA. And we've also talked today about the role of holistic skills and mindsets like stress management, growth mindset, and executive function. So the knowledge, skill, and mindset building section of our blueprint speaks to these ideas with practices to support. And so the example that I've pulled here is our co-regulation planner, which outlines an approach to teaching skills that's mapped onto each student's unique zone of proximal development. So as in this third example in practice, a whole child approach looks like meeting each student where they are and coaching them not just with academic skills, but also with a holistic set of skills that help them grow and develop agency and independence. And I will pause there because there's so much more that I could share, but I'm excited to get to your questions.
David?
Yeah, I'll share an anecdote. So at the same time we were mastering standardized testing, our superintendent initiated the first one-to-one computer to student ratio environment in 2003 in Fullerton, California. And we had a discretionary budget. We had 100% Title I and 98% English language learners. So we were able to buy all of our children a computer, a laptop, clamshell MacBook that was multicolored. Remember those things that hardly worked and could barely access the internet? Our kids had those. And for the first time, our kids outperformed their affluent kids on the Hill in podcasting, in iMovie, in creation of keynote presentations, because they were all starting from the same place with this new digital framework. And not only that, for the first time, our kids had the same access to information and resources that their affluent peers had. Prior to that, if you didn't have an Encyclopedia Britannica, you didn't have access to the information, but technology really leveled the game field for everybody. And that became a large focus of the next phase of my career. But then understanding that every child has unique strengths, interests, and values, and asking the question, not are you smart or not, but how are you smart? And creating opportunities within the school day for children to explore and experiment and find ways that they excel really gives their peers an opportunity to see things in them that may not have been seen otherwise if we didn't give them the opportunity. And so we've created a curriculum called The World of Work that's based on the community and the priority sectors in San Diego that include the military and law enforcement and public service and construction and development and manufacturing, in addition to 2-year and 4-year opportunities for humanities and those types of careers, but showing that there's dignity in all work and there's an opportunity for financial freedom for every child, giving hope to our parents and the students for their future.
So I think we have time for me to ask you this one last question before we get to the audience questions. So what are the challenges in implementing this whole child approach, both at the level of the classroom and the school district?
Oh, you gonna go?
Either works for me. You want to jump right in?
Sure. Okay. Well, when we started in Cajon Valley, this is my 9th year there. One of the things we surveyed teachers on was, what should we stop doing? And they all said we should stop using clipboards and checklists and monitoring what teachers are putting on the boards and focus standards and all these practices from No Child Left Behind. When we stopped those things and the board said, freedom not to do that, we're going to move into some project-based learning and technology. Teachers didn't know what to do with that because now we just moved everybody's cheese. So I think education is very risk averse and change averse. And lots of support and scaffolding is necessary to help our educators move, but also policy and practice. Until we're held accountable for the well-being and the relationships in the building, that's not going to happen at scale. A district like ours is an outlier, and people look at it and like, how are you doing that? Well, we have a governing board and leadership in the community that says this is what you should be doing, but that's not most places.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think that speaks to some of the things I had noted down as well. Just this idea that we actually have a shared aligned purpose with clear priorities that center the whole child and are willing to ask ourselves questions like, what should we stop doing? Feels like a really important first step. I know as a teacher, if I don't ever receive any feedback or support with whole child practices and instead am pushed to take on like this endless set of disparate initiatives, I'm not particularly empowered to take on the approach of whole child design. So I think that there are a bunch of different things that can help with that aligned purpose and set of priorities. I think one of the things that we talked about in the data from NWEA was this idea of measures of context and holistic student well-being and development. And so if we only rely on data like standardized academic testing, we don't really get the information that we need to align to a whole child approach. So that feels like an important step. And then, I also very much believe that there's this barrier around the knowledge, tools, and strategies that we actually need as educators to integrate into our practice. And so there's a level of awareness of ourselves and our students that's not always taught in teacher preparation programs or teacher professional development about what it means or looks like to develop the whole child. And I think some of the science that Pam just shared is part of this. And then as we build this knowledge, teachers really need the tools and strategies that they can use in an ongoing and integrated way throughout the school day, regardless of what they're teaching and what they're doing. So I'll stop there.
Great. Okay, now, Emily, I think we're supposed to do a survey, a participant survey at this point, before we get to the questions.
Nope, that happens a little bit later. You can keep on going.
Okay, then we will keep going. And can we get to the questions now? Is that okay?
That sounds great. We've got a couple questions, and I know
do.
you've asked people. Folks, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box. It's just helpful for us to see them there separate from the chat. Thank you so much.
So we have some questions, and I think these questions are basically for everyone. So Pam, if you could come back on. There's a question that says, how important is context in accelerating connections in the brains of young learners? So what do we need to understand about this context business, Pam? Maybe you can start.
Well, the context business is the business. It is everything. I remember the first time in a med school class where the professor said what I shared with you about 20,000 genes, 10% get expressed. What drives the 10%? And when I heard that, and over the years of learning, started to explain to myself what that actually means. It means that we have the opportunity to design for development. And that was not the principle, the core principle that sat underneath the design of 20th century learning. The minute you say that we are malleable to experience, and that under highly favorable conditions, which is what we mean by context, strong relationships, experiences, and safe environments in which we feel valued, those are the drivers. Those are actually going to produce the wiring, the connections in the brain that create complex skills. And right now we can look inside the brain. That's another thing we couldn't do when this system was designed. So we can actually take pictures of a wired brain, and we can take pictures of a brain that isn't wired. When children experience tremendous kinds of deprivations, you don't see this in brain imaging. So right now, whether you need pictures to be convinced or you need the scientific research to be convinced, there is well-established knowledge today that says the direction that we should move in is optimizing the context in which children learn and grow.
Great. Anything, Elizabeth or David? No. So I hope that that James has an answer for that question. And now we have, this is a question that I would ask. This is from Bonnie, a very specific question. Tell us 2 specific activities for the first day of school that will help set the tone for the year. So this is, forget the theory. What are these 2 specific activities? And anyone can start.
So I'd like to call something out, but I'd love to hear the practitioners, Elizabeth and David, tell us how it's going to actually happen. But you know from everything that I've said that it's relationships, relationships, relationships. So first and foremost is oxytocin. And you want kids walking into an experience of their first days in school where that is what is flowing, not cortisol. And that knowing children as individuals would be my number 2. So creating the kinds of activities where kids can tell their stories and tell the stories as individuals. So relationships and connection, telling your story. That's where I'd start.
Elizabeth, what does that look like at the classroom level? How do you get the oxytocin flowing? How do you make that happen?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to start with relationships. And you're making me want to go pull out my first 2 weeks of school plans that I refined year after year after year until I felt like I got them just right. But I think it's hard to pinpoint to really specific things because I think each group of kids that we have in front of us is different, but anything that we can be doing to help them build relationships with you as the teacher, to build relationships amongst their peers and with each other, and to be known within their classroom community feels super important to me. And so I know in my classrooms that often looked like lots of like scavenger hunts about peers and each other to better understand experiences and interests and strengths and commonalities. We did so many different versions of those over the first few days of school. I know, my students always loved hearing about my own personal first day or first week of school stories and better understanding the way that I was there to like meet them in the moment and really engage with them and could understand their, worries and fears and needs and hopes and dreams for the school year. So again, I think if we ask ourselves that question of, is this helping students build relationships with, each other and me? Is it helping create a supportive, trust-filled, safe environment? And am I starting to think through those skills that kids are going to need to have success within this learning community? Then you're on to like a really good track, and you could test most first week of school or first day school activities against, that set of criteria.
So Elizabeth, I just want to push a little more. It sounds like you're not saying that we enter school in the fall with the notion that children have lost everything with this sort of deficit approach to how we're going to get really quickly on track, which of course is important in one's head. But this notion of what did you learn? What were your experiences? How are you doing? Some real sense of connection to how they survived and endured this past year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. David, from a school district perspective, what are you guys doing?
If you remember when Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and the Bulls were in the heyday, when the Bulls came on the court, there was music and they would make these announcements, number 23, Michael Jordan, and they'd run out to applause. Our school staffs, they line the halls, they decorate it, there's music playing, and as the kids come on the first day, they're just so glad you're here, and oh my gosh, there's Jonathan, and there's people looking out for every kid, and the parents love it. The parents love leaving their children to us who are excited and welcoming there. And we've also built a social emotional learning curriculum, K through 12, and that's the first 3 weeks of school. We ask our teachers to do some basic dibbles and reading assessments, but aside from that, for grouping, for reading, focused on social emotional learning. And if we can build the relationships on the front end, then discipline and student engagement, all the things that really become the heartache of the teaching process, they go away because you invest in the front end of the relationships and the asset building so that kids feel wanted, respected, and know that there are places to go when they're having struggles.
Jacqueline, can I ask a tough question that hasn't yet been asked, but I'm sure it's on the minds of some of our listeners because I've been asked it before. So I've been asked, Pam, are you saying that here in the face of all of our parents being told or experiencing how much loss in learning time their children have had, you're saying start school and just don't think about academics, and that's going to be okay? And so I've had to answer that question in a variety of different ways. But the way that I work my way into the answer is that everybody knows that learning is not a passive enterprise. You can't just open the brain and pour knowledge and facts into it. The agency of the child and the engagement of the child is the ingredient that is not fully under your control, but what you do to access agency and engagement is actually what is going to ultimately let kids recover and make up and do all the things that we want them to do. So the key thing is this child your partner? Okay, does this child want what you're offering? And if they do, then they're going to be a willing partner, and you're going to have this beautiful flywheel of kids getting into the zone of being curious, wanting more, thinking that learning is a fun, rewarding activity. But that starts with all the things that David and Elizabeth just said. They have to be a willing partner at the front end.
More engagement, more relationship building. I want to address June's question. She says, please talk about the kinds of data that you collect for use and decision making. So we have a whole child approach, but what kind of data do you collect?
I'll start. Some of the data that we collect is not traditional data that you get from a school system. There's a great quote that says that the flaws in the education system will manifest themselves in the economy. And so we have the best workforce board in San Diego, the San Diego Workforce Partnership, and they produce data on opportunity youth. And these are kids that are aged 16 to 24 that are no longer working and no longer in school. So they're not engaged in anything. That's a really bad statistic to be leading in. And we found that our community, our high school district was producing that. And so we have to look at, well, how do we fix that? How do we fix gainful employment? How do we fix keeping engaged in the process and staying a lifelong learner? And the practices that will follow for those goals when you move the goalpost back a little bit are much different than conventional measures. Not to say that conventional measures are not important, they still need to be there, but in alignment with the long-term outcomes of the entire K-12, I would say K post-secondary ecosystem.
So a bigger picture and more questions. It seems you have more questions to ask about children and how they're doing over time. Okay. Elizabeth, I'm sorry.
No, let Elizabeth go. And I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the future of measurement.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sure hopefully I can set you up well for that, Pam. But I think really similarly, as a teacher, anytime that we could bring in more holistic data about what students' experience was looking like, whether that was information about like their participation rate in student-led discussions or information from families just about what students were describing their experience was like at school at home, felt like they were really, really important to the types of conversations that we were having that were informed by data. At Turnaround, we've been working on a new set of measurement tools that include both our whole child design inventory and our well-being index, which offer really helpful reflective data to look more holistically at the state of whole child practices within your school community, as well as just the level of well-being amongst your student population, and really valuing things like what students are telling us about what they need and what their experiences look like feels super, super important, in combination with some of those other more traditional measures. And I'll pass it over to you, Pam.
I'd like to use a minute to talk about a kind of if-then question. If everything we're all talking about today is that context drives development, design for context, children grow and learn as individuals, our current measurement system doesn't measure children across holistic dimensions. So the 21st century building block skills, we barely measure at all. We think that academic competencies are a proxy for intelligence, for worth, for a child's gifts and talents. And we don't measure context at all. Okay, so the driver of development is, there are no universal, well-developed measures of context that would take into account things like, what is a student's experience of stereotype, bias, race, lack of safety in a school setting? So from a formative perspective, we have to, what's ahead of us are holistic measures. So the full range of student skills and academic competencies get measured, and we have to measure context. Then we have the biggest elephant in this room, which are our accountability systems that were established in No Child Left Behind. That a standardized measure in 2 academic subjects defines what a child is capable of. So they're standardized, they're based on population norms that aren't the same as the kids being studied. The level of injustice and unfairness in this is enormous. So measurement is a very, very big area of challenge, even if we get our whole child design right. Yeah. That things are going to have to be changed around what measures we use in order for the incentives to be aligned.
Yeah, I spent a bit of my career in a measurement institution, and I think the folks who design measures have a real healthy understanding of their limitations. These measures give us a sense of what a child did on a particular day at a particular time. But the larger question of the social sciences is really what works for whom and under what conditions. And we often lose that question about for whom and especially under what conditions. And I hope we will start to do a lot more research that frames that question in a deeper way and explores it, but also some, as Pam has suggested, the development of measures that really can help us to understand more broadly how children are doing, because they're complicated little people. And just a couple of data points don't really always tell the story. We have a couple of questions that are framed around the same kind of inquiry. Taking this whole child approach beyond the classroom and beyond the district. So there's a question about what would this look like at community-wide? And there's another question about what would this look like not in a classroom, but in a more informal settings. If you think of those informal learning settings, museums and libraries and the like. So how do we broaden this approach? Is it possible? What would it look like? And this poll has gone up, I see. So please, as our panelists are trying to answer the question about broadening this approach, please fill in the poll. Thank you.
One of the things that I do want our audience to know is that when I spoke about the whole child design work, the playbooks that were recently launched, the first of them, yes, is directed toward a school environment, but the second playbook that'll come out in August is for learning settings that are not schools. Because what we're understanding more and more and believing more and more and seeing more and more is how children use multiple environments and experiences, particularly youth development settings, to grow in different ways and to discover the things that they're passionate and interested in. And how many times as a parent have we said, boy, I wonder why my child does so well and is not shy and speaks up in this setting, but they don't in their classroom. And this is right now, what we want to try to bring together is a community and school developmental context that is fluid, where there are no barriers and where the assets in a community actually, because schools can't do it alone, and the assets of a community can so much support the learning objectives of school, but also the developmental objectives for kids.
Great. Emily and David, any additions to that? Notion of informal settings?
I think that in your question, you answered some of that, Jacqueline, because the community is the answer. And so in our community, our Chamber of Commerce, our workforce board, our faith community, everyone participates in the education of our children because most adults work. And so in the context of our World of Work curriculum, we bring in the adults in the community, starting with our children's parents, to talk about how they found their career, what they like and don't like about it. So in the projects, they get to try it on, but then they get to talk to people who actually do it. And we're working with a group called Road Trip Nation that puts these contexts into a video archive that can be accessed forever. And I think that by showing that all work has dignity, there's dignity in all work, then we can look at the Navy, Marines, and Air Force in San Diego as a viable option, both for a career or as an opportunity to go to college, which a lot of our community has done. And that, getting a job out of high school before you start or when you start community college is a viable option too. Most school districts don't have mechanisms for families to see the options for them. And so we've taken that and built it into a comprehensive curriculum so that no child leaves without an idea of what financial freedom looks like for him or her based on their strengths and interests.
Great. So I think the answer to that question is this is certainly not an approach that is confined to a specific classroom. The notion of building relationships and having a respect and honor for the children and what they bring is something that we can do and should be doing in every interaction. We have another specific question. This is from Patricia, who wants to know if there is a reading curriculum that best follows the whole child design.
I put a link in the chat to Beable. We built our curriculum into a literacy technology that's based on metametrics and Lexile growth, but it attaches strengths, interests, and values, possible future self, which is a vocational psychology measurement, and also different types of benchmarks that you can measure a child on in a learner record. We think it's the best thing on the market. We're biased, but I'll share that openly.
Okay. So I'm assuming I have to say that the grade level reading campaign is not endorsing any particular reading. The lawyers that make you say that.
Yeah.
I'd also like for folks to know about Nucella. We do a lot of work together, and the thing I love about their online platform is how much it is driven by the interests of the students. You know, in terms of what they choose to read and how they access it. So that's one that I've been very excited by.
Great. And I have from Margaret, there's a question about the physical environment and how can the physical environment better support relationships? And she's asking, should we be thinking differently about how we design cafeterias and other common spaces to support this?
You know, one of the things that I love about that question is that, you know, teachers can't do everything. and so much of the focus, even when we talk about relationships, is obviously on the other humans. But we know that spaces can be designed to make these jobs so much easier. And like if you put a picture in your mind of the 20th century classroom of 35 kids, everybody lined up in a row, and you say, is this a design that is going to set us up to know each other? And kids have to be quiet. Okay, so what's that going to do? We have to be mind readers. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I think the more we can do that a teacher doesn't have to do, that the actual environment just does some of the work for you. And so much socializing happens in non-classroom spaces that it's like a no-brainer to me how those could be gold mines for nurturing informal relationships across grades, across teachers and students. So yes, with 3 exclamation points, those spaces should be redesigned.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think there's just so much cool work happening right now with sort of the physical space redesign. And I know I hope for every student that they're in the type of school that's optimized with those physical resources. And I think that there's also so much we can do, right? We think about like desks and rows not working. We can also shove them together and make space for communities of kids to work together, whether that's in the classroom or in the cafeteria. And I think you know, lots of interesting models around what the physical environment can look like to optimize relationships and also just optimize kids' developmental experiences within school. But then it's also how we use those spaces. If the expectation is that kids are quiet all the time, it doesn't really matter what type of furniture that we have set up, you know, in a physical space.
Yeah. David?
I'm so excited to be connected with Dr. Cantor and Dr. Darling-Hammond in this group, because now we have research and science to show that this is the right thing to do, but most states still have very rigid policy around seat time in the Carnegie unit. So there are some barriers that still need to be shattered at the state and federal level that hopefully now that COVID's shown us the way that we could just finish breaking down the barriers and move forward with environments like Pam and Elizabeth just described.
Nice. Thank you. Emily, do I have time for another question, or I think I'm looking at 4:29.
I know, and I think we do need to close it out. We do start to lose people a little bit, but my goodness, what an incredible conversation. And I know
So
a couple questions we didn't get to. Jacqueline, thank you so much for your brilliant facilitation. And David, your final comment, I just want to say that idea that you just captured is something that the campaign has been calling keepers, or other people are calling it too. So what are the things that came out of the pandemic that we want to hold on to? So as I mentioned before, we have a couple of sessions coming up in GLR week that are going to address this, but thank you, Elizabeth Miller. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jacqueline. And thank you so much, Dr. Pamela Cantor. This was absolutely amazing. And we're so excited to have had this chance to work with you. And we do want to just kind of say, as we log off, please make sure you complete that poll. We really take those into consideration. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Please join us next week for our double header on the 20th. As you see here on the screen, and the next quick slide, please join us for GLR week. As I mentioned, we're going to have lots of discussions around this idea of keepers, more discussions around this idea of learning happens everywhere. We're hoping that we might actually have Linda Darling-Hammond for one of the sessions. So stay tuned and join us and register. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. And we hope to see you again next time. Thanks again. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.